Another misunderstanding that has occurred in the island is that most white people are rich and came from the plantocracy. But after slavery had finished, what was left after the plantation owners departed was a lot of them were descendants from Scottish indentured servants as well as merchants. And these plantation owners needed people to manage their plantations for them. Now, a lot of people think, Bajans think, that all the plantation managers were mean and disliked. However, my dad has a story of when he was a boy during the 1930s riots, that he was standing on the wall of the plantation and the rioters passed by in St. Philip Bailey's plantation. Wow. And they shouted out to his father, which is my grandfather, "Don't worry, Mr. Proverbs, we're not going to trouble you, it's all right." And then they had the riots elsewhere.
Wow.
Yeah.
So obviously not hated.
Right.
At all.
And also my other grandfather, he was an overseer, so he wasn't fortunate to get a manager position. And the room he had to stay in was only big enough for himself. So his family had to stay in the south, whereas he was further away and he could only get to them by bus. So what that meant was that he only saw his family every other weekend, one day every other weekend. And the money that he sent home wasn't enough for them to rent anywhere big enough for 7 people, because Aunt Liz lived with them as well. So it was a 2-bedroom house where the 5 kids shared beds.
Wow.
And then the story goes, not sure if it's true, but when Granddad came home, he stayed on the couch. Well, that was in the eyes of my mum when she was a little girl. But then as times got better, he got another job. They moved out of that small house, and they were now able to feed people around them. So my mom has stories where her next door neighbor, who was black, which I actually had to ask her that, and she said that there were 9 little kids, and during Christmas time that her mom used to sit there and make stuffed dolls for these 9 little kids and give them at Christmas. So I said to my mom, "Well, what did you get for Christmas?" She says, "Oh, well, Granny used to paint our dolls for us so it would look fresher." So it wasn't that they had lots of money, but it's just that my grandmother's heart was to make these other kids' Christmas enjoyable. And there's stories too of when my gran passed away, that my mum came to this lady in the street, came up to her and said, "Hey, you're Miss Wilkie's daughter?" And she said, "Yeah." And she's, "Oh man, she was such a good woman. I knew that if my family was hungry, I could go to her anytime and she would feed me."
So you're saying there are a lot of misunderstandings, people's stereotypes about what this color means.
The slavery, even though it has been abolished 200 years ago, if it still has an impact on our people? The answer to that question is yes, without a shadow of doubt. We are told about a man, a slave owner, whose name was Willie Lynch. We also know that, as I aforesaid, that Barbados was a seasoning point for a number of slaves. We have that evidence because in South Carolina, we have the Barbadian-Carolina connection, where many planters took many slaves, thousands of slaves, to South Carolina to establish another slave plantation in South Carolina. We also know that today our people have a serious problem with dealing with the legacy of slavery. This is demonstrated in the way we relate to each other. This is demonstrated in the way that we relate to other people who don't look like ourselves.
I came across a book, Healing America's Wounds, which was addressing the very same issues that I was grappling with in terms of how could the land be healed and what the church needed to do in the process. And as I was working through this, one day driving past CBC, getting by Pine Hill Dairy, cresting that little hill that looks out over the St. George Valley, it suddenly hit me very, very strongly that in just about every cane field that I could see, innocent blood had been shed. and women had been raped without justice. And I began to understand what slavery had done in terms of not only the human element, but even in impacting nature, and that the land needed to be healed. And so then that began the process of thinking through, well, how do you deal with this? And the whole issue of repentance, and what I came to understand is known globally as identificational repentance, where one identifies with one's forefathers and one stands in the gap before God in an act of repentance.